All right, well, we're in Samuel, 1 Samuel, chapter 13. And chapter 13 starts kind of a weird way because it said, this is the new RSV version. It says, Saul was years old when he began to reign, and he reigned and 2 years over Israel. What are the dots? Well, if you have a different version, Rebecca, what's your version say for?
This is 1 year. When he reigned 1 year, and then when he had reigned 2 years over Israel.
Well, it was the first one, but he's 1 year old. Yeah, he wasn't 1 year old when he began to reign. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, that's what my book says, 1 year.
Yeah. Well, what the commentators say was that there was some kind of a problem with the people that copying over or something, because all the versions have something missing. Saul had to be in his 40s when he started reign, because his son, we'll find out in verse 2, his son was in charge of one of the armies. Well, if his son is old enough to be in charge of an army, he's got to be, basically in his 20s. And that's why I say Saul has got to be in his 40s. And in Acts 13:21, it says that Saul reigned 40 years. So that's another source that tells us the 40 years.
NIV says 30 years old.
Yeah, NIV says 30. 30 years old. Well, that puts Jonathan out there leading an army at 15 at the oldest.
Never know.
Yeah, those were different times. So Saul chose 3,000 out of Israel, 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan, and the rest of the people he sent home to their tents. So there's a map of the different areas that we talk about today, and you notice that they're all in the mountains. So later when it says the Israelites are hiding in the mountains, they're hiding in caves and stuff like that, you can see there'd be it's a rough territory, a lot of places for them to hide. Before Saul came to power, Israel didn't really have an army. When they had some national threat that came up, they would gather people up. They'd say, hey, come defend us, and then they'd go defend. But after Saul became king, then he called an army. And Saul must have been confident that 3,000 men were enough for his army, because he told everybody else to go home. And it might be because now he didn't have to feed the rest of them. So Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was Geba, and Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. When all Israel heard that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines, the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. Now this Saul, we're starting to learn a little bit more about Saul. And you'll notice he took credit for his son's victory, which he must have been pretty low character to take his own son's credit. Jonathan was a remarkable leader. He repeatedly led successful attacks, and we'll see that next week too. But this attack merely weakened the Philistines, or just barely weakened them. In fact, it's probably more aggravated them anything, sort of like when you're sitting trying to eat and a fly buzzes around you, you're aggravated. That's about what they were thinking of the Israelites. So the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped at Michmash at the east of Bethaven. And remember, Michmash was where Saul was there before. Now the soldiers knew that Saul wasn't telling the truth. They knew that Jonathan had defeated them. It wasn't Saul. And at Gilgal, he gave a phony report and that, well, that was about the truth. In the meantime, the Philistines were mad, and so they gathered this big army. They were ready to remove this thorn from their side. They prepared for full war. When the Israelites saw that they were in distress, for the troops were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. Some Hebrews crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So the Israelites knew this land, and they could see these troops more than they could number gathering, and they're like, oh crap. They're going to come after us. Jonathan had been bold enough to attack that garrison, but the rest of the Israelites were now overwhelmed by the pure numbers of the Philistines. So in great fear, they hid every place they could. The Israelites forgot that God was on their side. Saul must have communicated to Samuel and said, hey, we need your help. Come and meet me here. He may have told Samuel that he needed to come to prepare for war. And as you know, we don't tell God what to do. So he went, and he's there waiting for Samuel to come. And Samuel must have said, wait 7 days. I'll be there in 7 days. So Saul's waiting 7 days. The time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people began to slip away from Saul. So as Saul's waited, remember he's got 3,000 in his army. As he waited, every day they did roll call, and every day there were less people. And then the 7th day came, and Samuel still wasn't there. Saul knew the Philistines had this big army gathering, and he wanted to jump in and do something about it before they got completely organized. And when we talk about wars, that was all organized. They would get all their troops together, we'd get all our troops together. So you'd wait till everybody was ready to start fighting. And you see that if you've studied like the Civil War and everything, that's the way they did it. Well, Saul didn't want to wait. He didn't want to give him a chance to wait. He wanted to jump in there, but he had to wait for Samuel. He wanted God's help, but he couldn't wait for it. So Saul said, bring the offering here to me, and the offering of well-being, and he offered the burnt offering. Well, that was just plain a sin. First, Saul directly disobeyed Samuel. Samuel said, I am the one that gives the offering. And second, Saul was a king, not a priest. You had to be a priest to do an offering. Saul was telling God what to do, rather than seeking God's will and protection. It was like Saul saying, why do we need to wait on God? We got this. Saul needed the intelligence community to tell him where Samuel was. He needed to wait on Samuel, to wait on God. So as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, you know this is what I'm going to say, Samuel showed up. And Saul went out to meet him and salute him. Now Saul really overstepped his bounds. Literally, the Hebrew says, when it says he went out to salute him, he went out to bless him like one priest blesses the congregation. That's what he's going out to do, to bless Samuel. Saul was acting as a priest. First the offering and then giving a blessing. Samuel said, what have you done? Saul replied, well, when I saw the people were slipping away from me and that you did not come within the days appointed and that the Philistines were mustering at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. So Saul's answer is a classic excuse making. Line upon line, Saul made his position worse. I had to do something to impress the people and gain back their support. But of course, if we knew if Saul had obeyed God, God would have seen to the victory over the Philistines, with or without the people. You see, Samuel, it was really your fault. If you came earlier, I wouldn't have done this. Well, even if Samuel was in the wrong, it didn't justify Saul sinning. Or, I never understood why priests were so important anyway. Anybody could do this. We really needed God's help against the Philistines, and we needed it now, so I had to do it. And perhaps the Israelites around there admired Saul for offering the sacrifice. Man, there's a guy that knows how to get a job done. He gets things done and we can move forward. Now Saul could have made supplication to the Lord. He could have prayed in a number of ways, and he could have cried out to the Lord for the whole nation with a humble heart. The whole manner of Saul's explanation makes it clear that this was no misunderstanding. He didn't say to Samuel, "What, did I do something wrong?" He knew exactly what he did, and was probably had thought about those excuses ahead of time. But Samuel didn't want excuses. Samuel wanted to hear confession and repentance. Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandments of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the people have appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded you." Now Saul was a man after the people's heart. He was about image and prestige and the things people look for. But God was done with him. Though God rejected Saul, he did not reject Israel. Because God loved Israel, he would raise up a new king, a man after his own heart. A man after God's heart honors the Lord. Saul was more concerned with his own will than God's will. And David knew, when David came along, David knew that God's will was important. Even when David didn't do God's will, he still knew God's will was important. All sin is a disregard of God, but David recognized his sin and repented. Saul just wanted to use God for his own gain. Saul thought God would help him achieve his goals. David thought that God was the goal. When we set our hearts and minds on God, our end is certain. Eternal joy. Saul will still be on the throne as a king for a little while, but it will be a never-ending struggle because the Spirit had left Saul. Then Samuel left and went on his way from Gilgal. The rest of the people followed Saul to join the army. They went up from Gilgal toward Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul counted the people who were present with him, about 600. Because many soldiers had scattered. That's probably why Saul offered the sacrifice. Everybody was leaving. Now he's down to 600 men against countless Philistines. Saul, his son Jonathan, and the people who were present with him stayed at Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash, and raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah to the land of Shual, another company towards Beth Horon, and another company towards the mountains that looked down the valley of Zebulun towards the wilderness. The Philistines were looking for the Israelites to wipe them out. Now there was no smith to be found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines said the Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves. So all the Israelites went down to Philistines to sharpen their plows, mattocks, axes, or sickles. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 for the axes and setting the goads. The Philistines had superior military technology, and they wanted to keep it that way. Since they were a seafaring people, the Philistines would do trade out with other countries and bring back these modern weapons and the know-how to use them.